You're listening to Learning How to Live, the podcast about what happens after you wake up from the life you were told to want. I'm Quinn Stainfield-Bruce, and 6 years ago my best attempt at life had failed. Now I'm learning how to rebuild work, love, health, and self-worth, and I'm inviting you to learn alongside me. Let's get into it. Welcome to Season 1, Episode 1 of Learning How to Live podcast. This episode is called My Best Attempt at Life Failed. At 34, I walked myself into rehab from a place of material success. You know, I'd had good jobs, I'd had successful businesses, married, kids, car, all of the things. And I'd done all of the things that I'd been told to do, that society had told me to do. And I found myself 6 years ago at 34, emotionally and spiritually bankrupt. And so I've spent the last 6 years learning how to live. And it's been this transformational journey that I have experienced through thousands of hours of meditation, hundreds of hours of therapy, 12-step recovery, group therapy, spiritual awakenings. I did a degree and I studied Indian Buddhist philosophy and Taoism. I've explored most Eastern religions. I have gone back to Western religion and spirituality, and I have undergone Jungian analysis, and it's in the combination of all of these things over the last 6 years that I have actually learned how to live, or rather, I learned how little I actually knew about living. And when I say living, I mean everything. I mean romance, I mean self-esteem, worthiness, purpose, work, friendships. I didn't really know how to deal with any of these things. And the reason why I'm doing this podcast is because I don't think I'm the only one. You know, I came from quite a lot of privilege. I was lucky enough to be born, you know, in a country where there was no active wars, in a very middle class environment, you know, in the English countryside. You know, my parents did love me with all of their faults and foibles, and I was well provided for, and I went to, you know, English boarding school. And, you know, this is, you know, I guess top 1% lifestyle. And yet, having achieved everything I was told to go on and achieve, I was left wanting to die. And so I suppose my authority in sharing this message to whoever's willing to listen to it is that 6 years ago I did want to die. I wouldn't say I was actively suicidal. I wasn't formally planning anything, but I did know that if my life was going to go on the way it was, I would certainly rather be dead, which resulted in me taking a drastic and radical change. My life today, 6.5 years later, is beyond my wildest dreams. I'm not a multimillionaire. I haven't, you know, stockpiled loads of material things. I don't own fancy cars or boats or anything like that. In fact, I live quite a modest life in that respect. But I have wealth beyond my wildest dreams. I have romantic wealth. I've learned how to love. I have physical wealth. You know, the way I look after myself and my body today, you know, is I'm in the best shape I've ever been, and I am, of course, the oldest I've ever been. You know, my spiritual wealth, my understanding of a higher power, and this isn't about religion. This is simply about my relationship with something bigger than me and the contentment that that brings. My familial wealth, my relationship with my children, or with my parents, or with my sisters, with my family, is healthier, or at least it's healthier than it's ever been. And yes, I have such purpose in the work I do. And I didn't, for years and years, for most of my adult life, I worked to live. I worked to make money. And if you think we spend 80% of our lives at work, and we're doing it just so that we can make money to buy things that we then will think will make us happy, no wonder so many of us are, well, maybe not clinically depressed, but not particularly happy. And that's how I worked. I worked. I pursued money, and eventually, and it was in closing a fairly big deal, where I was working at the time and making a good sized commission check, that I realized that money was never going to make me happy, and the realization of that really brought me to my knees, and I walked myself into rehab. And it was off the back of those 4 weeks in rehab that I began to change my life. And these are the things I want to share. So, who is this for? Well, I'll be honest. If even one person takes something away from this, if one person can sort of see or experience some of the growth and the light that I have managed to experience, then the whole thing would have been worth it. But, practically speaking, I am in recovery. I did suffer from addiction. I no longer do. I am in recovery still, not because of drugs, but because it's a phenomenal way to live. But anyone who is struggling with substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, or maybe it's gambling, maybe it's food, maybe it's technology. Addiction is a very broad spectrum. Might be sex, might be pornography. Anyone who's struggling with addiction will be able to find something in what I have to say, because I struggled with addiction, and now I don't, and I will explain how I did that. Anyone who is struggling with insecurity, and how that can manifest in an infinite amount of ways, but I'm thinking namely relationships, attachment styles, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment styles, people who have never quite been able to find love. And that doesn't mean not having a relationship, but really feeling loved and being able to receive love, but also being able to give love. Because I can tell you that it's all rooted in our own insecurities and our own fear. We're all capable of giving and receiving love, and we all deserve it. But also people in relationships where there's no lust, where there's no, where the sex is okay or non-existent. But there's no excuse for a romantic couple to not be in deep lust with each other. Maybe not all of the time, but certainly consistently, no matter what happens. And I've learnt over the last 6 years how to love. I've learnt what a romantic partner is, a best friend, a partner in life, a lover. It's these things. So if anyone's ever found themselves in a loveless or sexless relationship, or dare I say a toxic one, I had to go through countless toxic relationships before I learnt my part in them and how to break free from them. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that. Parenting. I'm a father of 3 children. Nobody really showed me how to parent. I learned how to parent from my beloved and yet somewhat dysfunctional parents. They did the best they could, but that was who I learned from. There was no classes at school by authorities. There was no social media. I couldn't have even followed people who may have understood. So where did I learn how to parent? I learned from how I was parented. Do you have any idea how hard it is to reprogram one's parenting styles? It's very hard, and I have not perfected it, but I do pursue it, and I have learnt so much over the last 6 years about what parenting actually is. And I look forward to having guests on this show who are absolute experts at this, and to discuss what parenting today looks like, and to take what I did wrong, but then also to look at how I now do things correctly and why and what those lessons were, and to get into that. So parents might find this powerful, interesting. Certainly anyone who maybe didn't grow up in a functional household, let's say. I mean, I don't know who necessarily did grow up in a functional household, but I think you probably know what I mean. People who are dissatisfied with work. I mean, the research out there's a Gallup research poll that suggests that 91% of people in the UK want to leave their job. I mean, that's just unfathomable. The people's low engagement, not wanting to actually be at work, not feeling engaged with the work they do, the lack of purpose. This is a global epidemic. And if you are like me and you are waking up to the fact, or you have woken up to the fact that working to live isn't actually going to work for you, but what do you do about it? Do you just run off and become a coach? Which, there's a bubble bursting in that industry, that's for sure. But, it's about finding inner purpose, right? So the answer is not necessarily even about changing career, but about finding one's inner purpose and being able to align that to one's vocation, right? And sometimes it won't match up. Sometimes it won't work. But if one can first of all know what one's purpose is, then one stands a chance at aligning it to something externally that matters to them. So anyone wanting to unravel, the heart and soul and purpose at work, this could be very relevant. So, the spiritually hungry. I had no concept of spirituality before I walked into recovery. I never meditated, certainly didn't believe in any form of God of any sort. But we are culturally waking up to the need for something bigger than ourselves. My stance on this is, well, I have many, but in the age of the Industrial Revolution, in the time of the so-called Age of Enlightenment, 150, 200 years ago, where science and its fantastic advancements started becoming our higher power. We no longer needed the disconnected abstractness of formal dogmatic religion. There was a time before the Age of Enlightenment where we all as a species just believed in a god, or maybe gods. We would wake up, we would go and work, and we would work or working in a field, or we were a knight of the knight of the realm. Didn't really matter, but generally we believed if we were good, we went to heaven. If we were bad, we went to hell, and that was the end of it. After the Age of Enlightenment, we started calling out some of this dogmatic stuff, and with the advancement of science and the increase in productivity and capitalism, which, again, I have no issue with capitalism, I am a capitalist, but it's with the advancement of industry, we removed the higher power from our dynamic, replaced it with our own ego, and in doing so, made the pursuit of profit our purpose. And steadily over the last couple of centuries, that has reached a tipping point which is no longer sustainable, because the cost of always needing more is ultimately a human one. And this is why we are faced with the addiction rates we're seeing, the mental health declining, suicide rates spiraling out of control. There is a reason. And of course, technology and social media doesn't play a fantastic part in all of that. And furthermore, now with AI, it's not exactly going to get any better. But what we found, what certainly I experienced, is in the waking up to spirituality, there is a relief. There is a serenity. And what is spirituality in its simplest form? It's simply the acknowledgement that I am not the center of the universe, that I am a part of the universe. And in that pursuit, we are of service to others. We act from principles of kindness and love. And it's in those behaviors that our external world starts to change. So, it's not even woo-woo, it's actually really just human. And in and amongst it all is just, it's a beautiful way to interact with the world when one is not in self-centered fear. So yes, what else do I have here? So I touched on how I didn't know how to live. I didn't know how to be a parent. I didn't know how to function as a boyfriend. I didn't know, or a husband. I didn't know why work was important beyond making money, or why, I would want to, why it might be important to me. I didn't know what happiness was. I didn't know. I thought happiness was pleasure. Happiness isn't pleasure. Happiness is contentment. Happiness is waking up in the morning and feeling content. I thought it was pleasure, which meant I constantly needed to be putting something in me or experiencing something in order to feel happy. So I was constantly chasing. I didn't know. I didn't know anything about spirituality. I didn't know about being of service to others. I didn't know the benefits of doing it. I hadn't really been shown it. Everything was almost, I suppose, somewhat Machiavellian. Even if I was doing something for someone else, it was ultimately for my benefit. If I acted generously, it was because I wanted to be liked. If I went and helped something, it was because there was something I wanted out of it. Now, I wasn't conscious of this necessarily, but there's a big difference between real, true generosity and true selflessness. And, in order to do that, one has to be incredibly honest with themselves. And that's something else I didn't know how to do. I didn't know what honesty was. I thought honesty was simply just not lying, not stealing, not cheating. But those are just surface behaviors. Honesty starts with being able to be honest with myself. And that starts with the courageousness of being able to want to look within and confront the demons, confront the motives, confront the truth. Because underneath all of it are things like jealousy, envy, pride. It's anger and these bitter behaviors. And underneath all of that is fear. And so a lot of the time, honesty is the ability to acknowledge that I am afraid. And it requires a huge amount of bravery to be able to acknowledge that I am afraid. And then not just acknowledge it to myself, but to express it vulnerably to someone else, who then may in turn, well, my fear is I'll be rejected or ridiculed. But actually, in learning how to be honest, in learning what honesty was, in learning how to live honestly, suddenly I learned so much. I learned how to trust. I learned how to love. I learned how to be brave. I learned how to build friendships, relationships, businesses even. So honesty was a huge one. Learning how to be honest. Learning how to be patient. Learning what real patience was. Patience is the ability to surrender control, that I don't need to control how things happen when. There's a serenity in that as well. So there was many ways I didn't know how to live. I've touched a little bit on what I thought living was. But let me let me tell you why I was, I guess, the way I was. And I'm not blaming anyone here directly. I'm not blaming my parents. I love my parents. Very good relationship with my parents. But things happened, as they happen in all families, and it certainly, you know, made me the way I was. My trauma, we all have trauma in one degree or another. And my trauma, I look at it today and I don't see it as that severe. But let me tell you, trauma is subjective. You may have gone through something horrific, or it may have just been something that felt horrific at the time, but don't let it mean it's any more or less traumatic than somebody else's experience, right? Whatever we feel is traumatic is what is traumatic, and it's very subjective to us. And it's important to just allow these things to be expressed, at least to ourselves, to acknowledge, to not suppress things, to think that maybe the time that our one parent didn't greet us when they came home from school, or of course I came home from work, isn't that big a deal. If it felt like it was a big deal, then it was a big deal, right? It's just because it wasn't some sort of horrific abuse doesn't mean that it wasn't traumatic to us at the time. Now, my trauma was a combination of things, but there was a couple of big things for me. My parents argued all of the time. I don't really remember my parents smiling. We had loads of stuff. Like, we had a nice holiday home. There was a period of time where we had a small boat in the Caribbean. We had a nice home and lived in the countryside, and we were want of nothing, and yet I don't remember my parents smiling. They were never satisfied, no matter what. Now, of course, I'm sure that's not entirely true, but that was how I saw it as a child. My parents argued a lot, and eventually my mum left, but she took my sisters and left me. Now, there are all sorts of semantics involved in that, but as far as I was concerned, as an 11, 12-year-old boy, which was how old I was when it happened, my mum didn't want me. And that core belief solidified the idea in my head that I was unlovable and that I was worthless, because if my own mother doesn't want me, then I must be. Now, this was subconscious. I wasn't aware of this thought pattern, of course, but that's what was going on, and it was going on from very early, from that point on. And my father wasn't. My father, he was very emotionally unavailable, very physically present, and very good with buying me things, but completely emotionally unavailable because of his own journey. He did the best he could, but I also felt there was a unworthiness around not being able to be seen. So at 12 years old, entering puberty, I'm under the belief that I'm unlovable and I'm worthless. That's how I felt, except I didn't know that's how I felt. And so I head off to school, boarding school, and I cope with this in two ways. One is changing how I feel, predominantly with alcohol and drugs, but also with women. I was fixated with the idea that if I could just get a girlfriend, then I could feel better. If I could, because this is what I was chasing. I was desperately, anxiously attached. And for those of you who aren't familiar with attachment styles, I was so needy. I was so clingy. I would meet someone and I would think instantly that I was in love with them. If they were pretty and they were into me, that was all I needed to know, because that meant, right, that I must be worthy. If that pretty girl who other people think is pretty thinks they like me, then I must be worthy. And then I would cling on for dear life, because as long as I had that, then there must be a shred of hope that I'm lovable. And that immature narrative literally played out until about 4 years ago. That was how I lived my life. And I work with people today, men and women from all sorts of walks of life, successful, business owners, successful business people who are exactly the same. They can be high functioning in many aspects, but act like children romantically. And that's how I was. And so I thought I could change how I feel if I could get someone to love me. But mainly it was drugs and alcohol. There was a slightly more functional way, which was high achieving. I thought, as long as if I'm getting good grades, if I'm doing well in my homework, then that's justification that I'm not completely worthless. Less important, though. When I was 18, I started my own company. And, this was great because on the one hand, it gave me huge affirmation that I wasn't worthless, but it also allowed me to make a lot of money so I could do more drugs. And this was my life. I worked hard to make money so that I could do things that were pleasurable to me so that I could feel not shit. That was how I lived my life. That was the same loop over and over and over and over again. It really, the surroundings changed a little bit, but that was the modus operandi. I feel shit unless I'm doing something pleasurable. Therefore, I need to be doing something pleasurable. The pleasurable things cost money. I need to make money. So I would be working to make the money. So the company that I'd set up and run with, with various partners over 10 years, I eventually left because it couldn't sustain the amount of money that I needed. I went and got jobs, and those all were just, I was literally working until I could figure out a way to make more money. And it was just completely dysfunctional. In and amongst that, I met my ex-wife when I was 22, so very young. And, she was a mirror opposite of me, just as dysfunctional as me, but in different ways, and, we were both hurt people. And I'm certainly not here to speak any ill of my ex-wife. We were who we were, but it wasn't a healthy relationship. And we ended up having our first child when I was 25, and she was very sick, my daughter, when she was born, and that was a very traumatic 2 years. And I wasn't equipped emotionally to deal with that. I wasn't equipped emotionally to deal with anything, let alone a very, very sick child who required a liver transplant. She's fine now, but something certainly broke in me over those 2 years that I have since repaired. But when you're having to sort of hold down your 3-month-old baby whilst doctors are desperately trying to find a vein to put a cannula in so they can give her medicine, and she's screaming, and this is going on for 45 minutes, it's very emotionally traumatic. And I was not equipped to process those feelings. I had no idea how to do it. And so core beliefs of unworthiness and unlovability, which had been festering for years, had now more put on top of it. And so, my life went on, and that was, I was 25 when my daughter was going through that. And like I say, at 34, I walked myself into rehab, and I was ready to put everything on the line. Like nothing mattered except for radical transformation. And so what rehab did was it allowed me to just pattern interrupt. It allowed me to throw my hands up and say, I need help. I do not know what the answers are. I had known I had problems for years. I knew that I had maybe drug problems or drinking problems, or, that my romantic relationships weren't healthy. I'd known that, but I still thought I could probably fix it somehow myself. And it wasn't until I sort of surrendered and walked into rehab that I really admitted to myself and to everyone else, I don't know what the answer is. That surrender was pivotal, because that surrender allowed me to become open to other ways of doing things. And in and amongst that, I then start therapy. I start the group therapy. I start pursuing all modes of things, of anything else, anything that was going to help me grow and help me learn. So it was in that process and in those various different processes, which I'm going to talk about in the next episode. I'm going to talk about how rehab impacted me. I'm going to talk about how different types of therapy impacted me. And basically, the episode's going to be about what I wish I knew about therapy, rehab, etc., before because it may have helped me get into it quicker, because I'm not sure what I was so afraid of, but all of it has been a very, very beautiful process that has allowed me to basically learn to know myself. And it's in knowing myself that I get to practice that self-honesty. And it's through the self-honesty that I then get to be honest with others. And then I get to build loving, trusting relationships with people. And like I said, this is how behavior starts to evolve and starts to change. So I guess in summary, who's this for? Why am I doing? I'm doing this because I've learned lessons. I'm doing this because I went from being suicidal to living to having a life beyond my wildest dreams. And I want to share that with people because it's incredible. It's incredible. The tagline of this podcast is the title being "In Learning How to Live," but what happens when you wake up from the life you were told to want, right? I think many people are waking up. They've done all of the things. They've worked hard. They've got the relationships and the house and the job, and they're waking and they're saying, "Is this it? Is this it?" And it doesn't take anything away from all of the amazing things in your life, but no, it's not it. And if I can share what it is over the course of these podcasts, then and someone can take something from that, then that is such a gift. For me, it's a gift. It's a gift to share it. To share it with just one person is a gift, right? Share it with many. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing thing. So, in summary, that's why I'm doing this. The messages I have to share are hard fought and hard earned, and if I can give them to you without you having to go through the pain that I had to, or at least point you in the right direction so you don't have to find out everything the hard way, then that would be incredible. And also, look, we'll see how it unfolds, where it goes, what it evolves into. Right now, I want to share some of what I've been learning. I want to share what's transformed my life, what's brought me joy and happiness and serenity and safety and security. I want to share that with everyone. And if people can receive that, that's amazing. Where it goes from there, who knows? But I'm very excited to be on the journey with you. Thanks for listening to Learning How to Live. If this sparks something for you, share it, subscribe, and remember, you don't have to escape your life. You can build one worth staying for.